the genealogy of Jesus, it's very significant because it gives us the skeleton, the framework for all of the descendants of Abraham all the way through to the time of Jesus. And so by reading this particular genealogy, we realise that as we go through the Old Testament of the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, that we're actually following each of these descendants across a period of 2,000 years. And so this is a significant piece of genealogy. It also allows us to fulfill prophetic words. So in the Bible, the prophetic words tell us that Jesus will be born as a seed of, and it talks about that he will come from Abraham, that he'll come from King David, he'll come from Jacob, he'll come from Isaac. So they're very significant, this particular genealogy. So reading from here on our notes, this is the actual genealogy of Jesus as it's actually read. And it says, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. In verse 2 it reads, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And one of the things over the years that I've learned is that in the genealogy, as we look at each of these verses, they actually group together eras of biblical history as well. So in this first verse we have Abraham, Isaac and Jacob's son Judah and his brothers. So this is the period of time in the Bible that talks about going all the way from southern Mesopotamia when Abraham came out of Ur, and then it goes through to the land of Canaan. So these men, they're often called the forefathers or the patriarchs. So Abraham in the Hebrew was called out by God to be the father of his people. His son Isaac and grandson Jacob were also born in Hebrews until Jacob had his name changed to Israel by God. So when Judah was born, he was called an Israelite. So all this happened during the time of those first three descendants on that list. So the next verse, when we're reading in Matthew, we look at verse 3. It says, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram. So we start getting into some of the names which people are a lot less familiar with and that are not spoken of so much in the Bible. So from Judah, we know a lot about Judah in the Bible, but when we get to Perez and Zerah, we end up coming into this new period of time. Has anyone heard of Perez or Zerah, for example? So we have Tim has, that's fantastic. But it says here that his mother was Tamar, so we have the first female in the genealogy. Right? So Judah married Tamar, and these are the two sons. But we know, we read the Bible, that Judah actually had some other children by a different wife prior, and we'll go into that later. And two of those children were actually killed by God. Okay, so we're going to have a look at all of that. But these particular descendants, we go into this period of time where we've got three generations of Israelites, and they all go into Egypt during the time of the famine. So when we read the Bible, and again we'll look at it later carefully, we'll see that they actually go in as grandfather, father and son. So there's three levels of them. So Judah, his son Perez and his grandson Hezron, they're all born in the land of Canaan, and they moved together to Egypt to live a prosperous and free life. And then their son Ram was the first descendant born in Egypt. So in this verse 3, we see this cluster of people who all were grouped together in the sense that in the Bible story, they actually go to Egypt all together. So they're all contained in that same verse. Okay, so this will shed a bit of light on this thing, because normally we just skip through this and we wouldn't take much notice of it. So the next verse, when we go to verse 4, it says, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. So in this particular point in time, we've moved into names who perhaps are more unfamiliar again. We have less content of them in the Bible. Has anyone heard of Nahshon, for example? So Nahshon was a very significant person. He was actually the leader of the tribe of Judah when they went into the Red Sea. Right? So he was the person who was called to be that leader. And in the Jewish Midrash, they actually talk about him being the first person into the actual Red Sea. So he actually walked in. They say that the waters parted when he got in neck deep. Okay? So he was the leader. But when you actually look at the numbers of the size of the tribe of people, he was responsible for about 500,000 people, the biggest tribe that came out of Egypt. Right? So this person, he's only mentioned twice by name in the Bible. We find that he's actually responsible for 500,000 people. When they went down to Mount Sinai, he was actually one of the 70 elders. So he actually went up Mount Sinai and met with God. So we have this extraordinary person in the Bible who's hardly mentioned by name. When he is mentioned, he's mentioned when they're actually building the tabernacle, because they were all required to bring their offerings when it was built. So he was one of the leaders that's named who took his offerings when the tabernacle was built. Okay, so again we have these sort of nameless people, but in fact when we delve into the Bible a bit more deeply, we find they have a whole story. So he was there right throughout the journey through the 40 years, but he never made it into the land of Canaan. Okay, so all those people are grouped together in there. So the Israelites, during this generation, they were subjected to oppressive slavery in Egypt. Ram's son Aminadab and his grandson Nahshon were born into slavery until Moses was sent to lead them out of Egypt, what we commonly know as the Exodus. Nahshon was the leader of the tribe of Judah when the Israelites went into the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. Salmon was the first descendant of Abraham to inherit land in Canaan, given by allotment from the promise of God's covenant. So when they all went into the land and they were all given their inheritance, he was the forefather of Bethlehem in that sense of the word, because he was the descendant who was allotted land there, and it was from that location from which we know that Jesus was actually going to be born. Okay, so we have this connection with this place. So from Salmon forwards, we have all of these generations that lived in Bethlehem, which we become more familiar with as we read the Bible. So Salmon was the first in. Amongst the men of Israel's army who fought and defeated many enemies, he settled in Bethlehem and fathered Boaz, who was the first generation born in the promised land. Followed by Obed and Jesse, all three generations were born during a tumultuous period when the leaders were known as judges. So all of those people are all bound by the period of judges in the Bible. So can you see the significance that I'm saying now? So we've gone from the patriarchs in the first verse, then we've gone to the people who went into Egypt in the second verse. In the third verse, we have those who were put into slavery in Egypt. And then in the fourth verse, or verse 5, because the first verse doesn't give genealogy by the descendants here. But in verse 5, we now go into this period of time of judges. So you can see the significant periods of time in the Bible that are connected to each of these different descendants. So moving into the next verse, it says, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So if you look at this, the list is actually a little bit shorter. All right, we've got Jesse the father of King David. Then we have his son Solomon, who had been Uriah's wife, but then it stops there, whereas the other ones have an extra descendant. Anyone want to hazard a guess why? Why do you think that it stops there? So we go Jesse, end of Judges, first King David, or second king, but first in the genealogy, King David, then King Solomon, and then it stops there. What happens that separates that period of time from the next? Any thoughts?
It was not when it was divided.
Right. Okay, so these two kings, King David and King Solomon, were actually ruling what was called the United Kingdom of Israel. So there was no southern kingdom and there was no northern kingdom. So this genealogy goes from during the time of Jesse, when a king was asked for with Samuel, and then we had King Saul, who's not in the genealogy, but we have King David, who is. So King David, King Solomon, United Kingdom, and then it stops at that particular point. So, so the next verse goes Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abiah, Abiah the father of Asa. Okay, so suddenly we enter into a new period in biblical history, and that's that the United Kingdom of Israel is now separated into two. So the United Kingdom is no more. We now have the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom became known as the Kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, and the Southern Kingdom became known as the Kingdom of Judah. Okay, so that happens in this period of time. So this happened because King Solomon sinned and turned away from the Lord when he built altars and places of worship to foreign gods for his foreign wives. So we have King Solomon, who was, spoken of with great wisdom. In fact, when King David went to build the temple, God said, no, that's for your son. So King Solomon built this temple. He started to rule the nation. He increased the cohesiveness of it, so there's parts of the land that weren't under control until him. It was said there was kings and visitors from all over the world used to come to him. So he's a very significant king. But then what did he do wrong? How did he get in trouble? Anyone remember?
He married concubines
And
from other nations.
right.
And then he worshipped gods, false gods.
Right. So he
And sacrificed children on the altar.
Right, so before the Israelites went in, and when they went in, God told them not to intermarry with women from other nations or other cultures. And the reason is because they were worshipping other gods. So he knew what would happen if they were influenced. So he said not to. So King Solomon, of course, doesn't just marry one, he marries 300 wives and 700 concubines. So he kind of lost the plot along the way. And of course what he started to do is he started to build these high places and altars for his wives' religions, if you will. And of course they were sacrificing children. There was all sorts of horrific things going on. Okay, so it drew him away from doing what he should be doing for the Lord. So while the Temple of Jerusalem's here operating for his people, all of them were almost had this choice between all these other foreign gods as well. So we have this situation. So this happened during this period of time. So the United Kingdom fails for this reason because God punished him, and his son Rehoboam only ruled the two southern tribes of Judah, which is Benjamin and Judah, and to form the kingdom of Judah. And King Rehoboam fathered Abiah, and both of them sinned and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as the Bible tells us. Abiah fathered Asa, but he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So we enter into this period where we have good cop, bad cop. We have good kings and bad kings. Right? They go through this revolving door. So the verse 8, the next verse, says Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram, and Jehoram the father of Uzziah. So during this particular period of time, what's significant about it is that the kingdom of Judah is plagued by the worship of foreign gods. This is the significant thing that ties all of these kings together. So King Asa and his son Jehoshaphat both walked in the ways of the Lord. Asa removed temple prostitution and the idols his father had made, but not the high places of worship to false gods, nor did his son Jehoshaphat when he became king. King Jehoshaphat fathered Jehoram, who turned away from the Lord also. And there are three kings in succession between Jehoram and Uzziah: the short-lived Ahaziah, his son Joash, and his grandson Amaziah. So Uzziah was King Amaziah's son, who pleased God but also failed to destroy the pagan places of worship. So we have this situation where on one hand they're upholding the temple, and on the other hand they're still permitting other things to happen. So they're not walking with God the right way during this particular period of time. So going to the next verse, verse 9, it reads, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah. Now during this time the significance is that the kingdom of Israel is destroyed by the Assyrian Empire while the tumultuous kingdom of Judah submits to them. So remember, we have the northern kingdom, we have the southern kingdom. So in this phase of these particular kings, the actual Assyrian Empire took all of the northern kingdom away into exile. So King Uzziah was afflicted with leprosy when he became arrogant and sinned against the Lord. So his son Jotham governed Judah until he became king. King Jotham was faithful to the Lord and ruled during the expansion of the Assyrian Empire. Jotham was deposed by a pro-Assyrian. So when we read the Bible, we're getting a little bit of historical stuff. It says he's deposed by a pro-Assyrian faction, and this is in the Bible, who placed his son Ahaz on the throne. King Ahaz led an evil life, submitting himself to Assyrian authority and pagan worship. He closed the temple of Jerusalem. So you can see we've got this end of this period where the temple of Jerusalem actually comes to a close. The Assyrians have taken off the northern kingdom, so it's a pretty bad period in the Israelite history. And then of course he fathered Hezekiah. In verse 10 reads, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Ammon, Ammon the father of Josiah. So during this period of time, the kingdom of Judah returns to independence only to give it up again. So King Hezekiah restored the temple of Jerusalem and the worship of the God of Israel. He also threw off the yoke of the Assyrian Empire, and his son Manasseh reversed his father's reforms and reinstituted pagan worship. And when he was brutally taken captive by the Assyrians, he repented to the Lord and was returned to Jerusalem, where he tried to undo the damage that he'd done. When his son Ammon became king, he too reversed his father's reforms, but was so sinful his court officials actually assassinated him in the palace, and he was the father of King Josiah. So again, we have this significant period where the temple has gone from being closed to being reinstituted, but we see this sort of good cop, bad cop situation where we get this fluctuation between the kings. Going to verse 11, it reads, And Josiah the father of Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim, depending on your version of the Bible, and his brothers Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, at the time of exile to Babylon. So during this verse, the kingdom of Judah loses its independence first to the Egyptians, then to the Babylonians, who take the people of Judah into exile. So we have this period of a loss of independence. King Josiah restored the worship of the God of Israel, cleansed the kingdom of Judah all of pagan worship, and renewed the covenant. The Assyrian Empire disintegrated, so Josiah returned Judah to self-government, but died at the hand of the Egyptians. Succeeded by his sons, the Egyptians took Jehoahaz into exile and placed Jehoiakim on the throne. And killed by the emerging Babylonian Empire, Jehoiakim is then placed on the throne as a puppet king until these people are taken away into exile. The temple of Jerusalem was destroyed and the kingdom became part of a province under the rule of the Babylonians. So what's happening in the background in the Bible is that we've got these empires who are around this land, and they're fighting and they're expanding, and then they're retracting, and then a new empire is taken over. So in the Bible, we've gone through this period of the Assyrians, and then we go into the period of the Babylonians, which is what happens here. Of course, when we get to verse 12, the Bible specifically says, after the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. So what happens is we have this marker in the genealogy about Babylonian exile. It's a very significant marker in the Bible. Okay? So the kingdom of Judah at this point in time ceases to exist, and the people of Judah are forced to live in exile. So we go back to the situation where we had the Egyptian period of time where they're in exile and slavery, and then once again God's people are punished and they go off into Babylonian exile this time. Okay, so we have this significant point. Now, the actual descendants here says Jeconiah the father of Shealtiel, so he was the last king, and then it says a lot to take in, isn't it? We're going to go through this in the long distance of the course, but again, I'm just giving you the framework to understand that when the Bible writes many things and we read it, we might think, well, it's genealogy, it looks a little bit boring. when you look into it and understand in context the whole picture of the Bible, you realise that these things are actually very carefully grouped together. So if we look at God's hand on this situation, if you think about the grouping of the descendants and we take the Bible as the Word of God, we see something really significant happening here. There's no coincidences going on here. There's actually these set periods of time connected to particular descendants in the Bible. Okay, we've got whole empires coming and going. We've got periods of judges and kings and slavery. So they're very significant events. Okay, so Shealtiel, in that particular verse, he was a prince basically because he was the son of a king. Unfortunately, however, he was born in exile, and so he was never to return home. The Bible told us when King Jehoiakim went into exile that there would never be another king that would rule over Israel again. So the next descendant was Zerubbabel, who was born in Babylon. Notice the second half of his name is Babel, so you can almost divide it into two halves, Zerub, Babel. Babel is the name for Babylon. Okay, so he was born in Babylon. The next verse then goes, Zerubbabel, the father of Abiad, Abiad the father of Elikim, Elikim the father of Azor. Now we get into the period of the Bible which we could say doesn't exist. Okay, we get into this period of time where the story of the Bible, the first person story, literally runs out. Okay, because once we have the time of the Nehemiahs, the Zerubbabel, the governors in the first instance when they rebuilt the city and they rebuilt the temple and the altar, we go into what's called the 400 silent years of the Bible. Okay, it's no longer part of the Hebrew Bible after this particular point in time. However, the Bible doesn't end there. And the reason it doesn't end there is because the prophetic books of the Bible, the prophets, speak about things that are yet to come. So for example, if we go into the book of Daniel, which we'll look at a lot, you'll see that all these things that happen in the future are actually all prophesied and then they actually happen. So we just find about it in a different way, but most times people don't read the Bible in context, and so they don't see that big picture. So what we're going to do is we're going to put all this together in context. So during these descendants, the Babylonian Empire becomes overrun by the Persians, and the exiled people of Judah are returned home as subjects of the Persian Empire. So when they go back, it's the province of Judea, and this is the period of time in the Bible that we learn about the second temple of Jerusalem when it was actually rebuilt, another significant event. The returning Israelite descendants are now known as Jews. So this is that first point in the Bible where the Jewish people, as we call them today, they're actually named because it means the people of Judah. So when they were taken into exile and they were brought back, it was the people of Judah who were taken into exile to Babylon, not the people from the northern kingdom who were taken out by the Syrians, but the people from the southern kingdom. So they got their name changed. So during the time of the Bible, we start off with Abraham, who was a Hebrew, and Hebrew means from the other side of the Euphrates River where Ur originally was, which we'll have a look at. And then in the time of the Israelites when they were in Egypt, comes a time in the Bible when suddenly God starts to call them Israelites for the first time. So they switch from being Hebrews into being Israelites. At this point in time, they switch from being Israelites into being Jews. Okay, so this happens during this period of time. Now, Zerubbabel, when he came back, he became governor of Judea and fathered Abiad, who was the first generation born in the province of Judea under Persian rule. There's no personal story for Abiad in the Bible, but he fathered Eliakim, and Eliakim fathered Azor. All these descendants, however, lived under the rule of the Persian Empire. So that's that period of history. And then in verse 14, the next lot of descendants says Azor, the father of Zadok, Zadok, the father of Akim, Akim, the father of Eliad. So during this period of time, we've got the Persian Empire overrun by the Greek Empire, and it splits into 4 Greek-ruled regional empires, with the Jews ending up in the province of what was known as the Ptolemaic Empire ruled from Egypt. If I ask you the question, and this is all in the Bible, where is the Greeks and the split of the Greek Empire spoken about in the Bible. They come in as prophetic words in the Bible.
Daniel.
So Daniel's one of them. Have you got an example, Tim?
When he speaks about what is it, statue?
The statue?
Yeah.
So he has visions, and in those visions, one of them, there's several of them, but one of them he sees the statue, and the top part of the statue is gold, the next part of the statue is silver, the next part of the statue is bronze, and the next part of the statue is stone. Each of those represent these changing empires. Okay? So we have the Babylonians at the head, and then we go to the Persians in silver, and then we go to the Greeks, and then who comes next are the Romans, and they're actually the stone. So in Daniel's prophetic words and visions, he actually speaks about all these things that are yet to come, and of course they're fulfilled. History tells us they were fulfilled. So again, the Bible doesn't leave us in the dark. It's just a case of, do we read these books and do we understand what they're actually talking about? Okay, so Alexander the Great, of course, was the leader of the Greek Empire, and he expanded it to the greatest empire that had been known in history at that point in time. But he died very young. He died in his beginning of his 30s, and he had no immediate successor. He hadn't had any children. Okay, so suddenly we normally have kingdoms or empires, and they normally get handed down generation by generation. But of course this didn't happen, he didn't have any children. So what happened is all the generals who were serving him, there was a situation where there was a bit of a squabble happen, and it ended up getting divided up into 4 different Greek-run nations who were all the generals. And so they became known as these different empires. So the province of Judea, which of course is where these people are, or the former kingdom of Judah, it became part of what was known as the Ptolemaic Empire, which was ruled by the Egyptians. So Ptolemy was the general who took over that part. Zadok fathered Akim, the first descendant born under Greek influence rule, and Akim fathered Eliad, who grew and lived under the same Ptolemaic Empire. So by the time we get through this, we go from the Persian Empire through the Greeks and into the beginning of the Egyptians in control of their country. So you can see they were no longer in control, they were no longer running their own country, they were under a foreign ruler all the way through this time. So verse 15, it says Eliad the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob. So we get back to Jacob, to the New Testament, so we start getting back to familiar territory again. During this period of time, the province of Judea changed from the Ptolemaic Empire, so that's the Egyptians, to the Seleucid Empire, which is like today Syria and top of Iraq. And it expanded, all these empires expand. And under the Seleucid Empire, the Jews actually revolted and they freed themselves as an independent and sovereign state. Now Eliad fathered Eleazar under the Greek influence rule of the Ptolemaic Empire, and they were overthrown by the Greek influenced Seleucid Empire, as I just mentioned. Eleazar lived through the horrific period of time in which many Jews were slaughtered. So this was not a good period of time in history for the Jewish people. Many of them were actually sold into slavery. And this is, again, we find this in history, this particular part. The other thing, and we read about this in the book of Daniel, is that they placed the Greek god Zeus Olympus into the temple of Jerusalem. And it's known as either the awful horror or the abomination that causes desolation, depending on your biblical version. So many people began to gather in synagogues, and a new scribal class of pro-Greek Sadducees and anti-Greek Pharisees formed, made up of record keepers, priests, and experts in the law. So we have this period of time where when we get to the New Testament, we have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they actually came into being at this particular point in time under Greek rule when the revolt happened. So some of them went in favour of, and some of them went away from. So we end up with this situation where they split. So the Pharisees, they actually were aligned with the poor, and the Sadducees were more aligned with the rich. The Pharisees actually were the ones who enforced the oral Torah, as it's called today, and whereas the Sadducees refused the oral Torah. And the oral Torah was written down so it could be kept, and that was done during the time of the Babylonian exile. So we're introduced to this period of time, which isn't in your Bible, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This Jewish revolt led to the priestly family of Maccabees. So it's a deuterocanonical book. It's often found in Orthodox or Catholic Bibles. It's historical. It talks about what happened to the Jewish people, but it's not part of the canon of Hebrew scripture. So most denominations of churches around the world don't count the Maccabees as part of their canon of their Bible. It is, however, very useful as a historical document because it tells you exactly what's happening during this period of time. So they had a holy war against the Seleucids, the Greeks, and progressively took hold of Jerusalem and Judea. So Mathan was born into this struggle, but lived to see the Jewish people recognised as free and sovereign state for the first time since Babylonian captivity. It was actually the Romans who actually recognised them. So we're getting pretty close to the time of Jesus now, and we find that the Maccabees actually freed this province of Judea into an independent state once again. Okay, the next verse, the second last one, it says, "And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ." So we get to this fulfillment of prophecy at the end of the actual genealogy. So verse 16, which we just read, is now the independent and sovereign state of Judea. It became known as the Hasmonean kingdom. It was torn apart by warring brothers who were vying for power, who, when seeking support from differing nations, ended up with the neighbouring Nabateans. A real period of turmoil happening in this region again. So Jacob was born and lived as a free man in Judea under the rule of the Hasmonean kingdom. He fathered Joseph, who was also born a free man, so this is the father of Jesus. But this was not to last, for an expanding Roman Empire overran the region, weakened by constant war. Judea became part of the Roman Empire, now called the province of Judea. Joseph married Mary, who became pregnant by the Holy Spirit and became the legal father of Jesus, the Son of God. So we go through this story all the way from Abraham right through all of these different empires and kingdoms, the periods of judges, the slaveries, etc., the exiles, and we get to this point at the end of the genealogy where we're introduced to Jesus. And of course this is the first chapter of the book of Matthew in the New Testament. So this is where we start from in the New Testament in essence. Now the last verse here, verse 17, it says, "Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Christ." Now this genealogy, as I've said here, it's not pointless. As you can see, it's not just a list of people that doesn't have any significance. When you understand this, it's actually painting the whole framework for the whole Bible from the time of Abraham right through until the time of Jesus, and obviously the New Testament continues on from the time of Jesus. So this genealogy encases all of that. It's not something that's written for vanity or glory, which is often associated with great men. When we read historical genealogy, we have king lists. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. They're all the rulers, all the power, they have all the stories, the wars they won. So it was like an honour list or a glory list. But this isn't. In fact, when you read through this, you just hear how they're constantly conquered, they're exiled, they're put into slavery. You know, many of them aren't even written into the journey of the Bible. So it's certainly no glory list. However, it's a significant list because it substantiates that Jesus is the Messiah because he was born of this nation and this family. The other thing this genealogy tells us when we go through this is that Jesus is not born from a perfect bloodline. So the bloodline has lots of infusions into it. It has foreign people. For example, when Boaz married Ruth, Ruth was from Moab. So she's someone from another nation. So we know the bloodline wasn't pure from that. Okay, that's one example. There's many examples. But the point is, it's not about bloodline. A lot of people think that inheritance comes through bloodline descendancy, and normally that does, and that applies for the Jewish people. But as Christians, it's different. This actually tells us, and Jesus tells us, that it's not by his bloodline that we enter into the kingdom of God, because his own bloodline is not actually pure. Okay, so this is significant. Any questions at this point? It's a lot of information. Right, you've got the information here. If people are watching, you can re-listen to it. It's been recorded, so you can actually listen to it again. But the Bible, no words in the Bible are wasted. And in fact, some of the most significant words in the Bible come from what we seem to take notice of the least. So this is a very significant piece of scripture. Okay, so Abraham was promised, and I'll give you these references. Abraham was promised that Christ would descend from him. So this goes back to Genesis 12:3, and we'll start reading through this as we continue on. And again in chapter 22, verse 18. David was promised that Christ would descend from him, and there's references there from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12, Psalms 89, verse 3, and Psalm 132, verse 11. Remember when we started the genealogy of Jesus, what did it say? It said a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. These are significant connections. This tells us who the Messiah is, because they have to be a descendant of Abraham, they have to be a descendant of King David. So it's a consequence of this that unless Jesus is a son of David and the son of Abraham, he cannot be the Messiah. So this is really important, because there's lots of claims that Jesus isn't the Messiah, or that somebody else in fact is the Messiah. But the window of time has passed, because these people are obviously a long time ago. Abraham's 4,000 years ago, David's 3,000 years ago, Jesus is 2,000 years ago, and so this has already occurred. The good news is that there's plenty of evidence to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, and that each descendant recorded in the genealogy of Jesus took their own journey through history to fulfill the promise of the covenant. So if you think about it, when we look at genealogy, each and every person in this list had a role to play in Jesus' coming. So when we read our way through all of the Old Testament and we get involved in all of the stories, we can sometimes lose sight of the fact that there was a plan that God had throughout all of these things. Even though man kept walking away from him, God's plan never ever changed, because God had a covenant with Abraham and a promise that came with that covenant from which Jesus would come. So each and every person in this genealogy plays a role in that covenant, whether they were good or whether they were bad. It didn't matter. They were people who were significant. So when the Son of God took our nature and came to walk amongst us in the flesh, he experienced life in the same way that we do, and yet remained perfectly free from sin. So we can know from this genealogy and the journey through the Old Testament that nobody was perfect. We know that Jesus came for that reason. There would be no purpose for him to come otherwise. So this genealogy just pays testament to that. So when you read each of the names in this genealogy, you'll understand that some of them are giants who are great and well known, whilst others seem overlooked and unknown. Using the genealogy of Jesus to provide the pathway for this journey from Abraham to Christ, I'm going to bring scripture to life, but bring context of each of their lives by placing them in the geopolitical environment of their time, so you can experience the life of each person. So in other words, to have it in context, we need to understand what it was like to live then. Obviously, when we talk today, you hear each generation saying it was different in their time. So if we try and understand our parents and how they were brought up, it will be different to how we're brought up now, and so on and so on and so on. If we don't understand what it's like, all those things that we remember about our parents where we think, I wasn't very happy about it, I wasn't happy about this. But the thing is that the context is completely different, isn't it? Because their life and their time was completely different. And so this is what we have to be aware of. We can't understand oftentimes the journey that our own parents have been through in order to be who they are, and we often blame them for things that happen to us when we grow up. Right? But then if we walk in their shoes and see what happened to them, then we can perhaps understand better why they were like they were when they brought us up. And so this is what genealogy shows us. It exposes that whole journey through to Jesus. Okay, so at the end of the day, to understand God's plan is about restoring his people back into relationship with him. The journey of the Bible tells us that there's nothing that anybody could actually do to actually cause a relationship with God. It's by God's grace that we have relationship. So we can see the pickle or the mess that a lot of the Bible has, and so as a consequence, Jesus had to come. There was no other way. There's nothing that we can do to bring ourselves back. Okay, any questions at that point in time? That's a lot to take in. So that's the framework for you to actually keep. So hang on to this. So the document that you've got, hang on to it, because this is your framework through this whole teaching, okay? And you'll see as we go through it that it fulfills everything that's actually said in those lists there. Okay, so let's start off with a nice question. When did history begin? When did history begin? When did recorded history begin? From the beginning.
Time of Moses.
Time of Moses? Any other thoughts?
When time was created.
When time was created, so we've all got biblical answers.
When God,
But is,
God's been here
Ever.
ever.
Right. So what if I switch my own and I say, when did secular history begin? Let's separate that from the Bible now. When did secular history begin? When did man start documenting
You have to be in here.
what happened?
From the beginning.
From the beginning? Aside of the Bible? Any idea?
Cave writing.
Cave writing?
If you
Right.
believe it.
In ancient times they developed scripts, didn't they? Types of writing. So one of them is called cuneiform, for example. And there was a symbol where they got a piece of clay and they got a stick and they pressed it into different shapes and they formed different characters and letters. So there is loads of them that have been discovered. In fact, some sites, there's a site in Iraq called Ancient Mari, which we'll talk about. So Abraham would have gone through this city in his journey up to Haran, and they found 25,000 cuneiform tablets there. And it listed kings and what they ate and their stores and their laws and all of this sort of stuff. Right? In the city of Ur, where Abraham came from, they also had tablets. They recorded a lot of information. So when we read the Bible, it simplistically says to us that Abraham was called out of the city of Ur, but there's something much more than that. Yes, Debbie?
Sarah Jones said 5,779 years ago, Hebrew calendar Genesis.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. That's true. But secular history doesn't start at that point in time. So we've got a separation between the documentation from the Bible and secular documentation. This is one of the reasons why there's a lot of arguing that goes on about dating. Because the Bible is the only place, and the Jewish people are the only people, who actually record history back to the day of creation. But this is not the case in all other religions. This is not the case in secular history. It's only in the Bible. But it doesn't tell us about the actual history of what actually happened to them as a people. So it starts off as 3,000. I can't see it from here.
3,500.
There you go.
I have
So
to
there's-
write that in because I haven't got it.
So the thing is that as you can just imagine with this information as well, as discoveries are made, and they happen every year now around the world, they're actually rewriting history all the time. Right? They're finding new places, they're finding new records, and suddenly it's like, oh, this is what we always believed. Now we know something different because something new was found. So secular history continues to change. So in this information, it talks about the origins of society. So we're talking about the time of Moses, right? So Moses, the ark, the Bible tells us, landed where?
Ararat?
In Mount Ararat. So Mount Ararat is in Turkey today. So on this map here, you can see it behind me, it's basically just up the top here, okay, is where Mount Ararat was, okay. So from there, you can see what we've got here. This green band here is called the Fertile Crescent, okay. Now in this Fertile Crescent, it contains the origins of the Bible. Because when Noah's descendants came, what does the Bible tell us? It tells us they went where? It tells us they went down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the other area they went to was down into Egypt, Cush. Remember the descendants? Cush, some of them were actually named Egypt, Cush. Right, Cush is Ethiopia today. Right, Sudan, all these names. So basically, these descendants, Ham split off and went this way, and Shem and Japheth went the other way. So there was a mixture of people in the middle, and then we have these things. So Shem, or Sem as the Hebrews would say, his actual son, who is the language is named after. They're called Jewish people Semitic, so the language is Semitic. Right, so it comes from him. So these two areas are the areas. When you look at a map, you can sort of see why. See, because all of this in the middle, and it is today, is desert. It was barren. There was nowhere to live. But where there's water, there's life. So this system of water on this side became the origins for the descendants to go, and the water, the Nile Delta, became. So the two richest parts of the world in the early days, of course, were associated with this source of water. And the source of water, of course, gives you irrigation, allows you to grow crops, allows you to graze cattle. So for survival to happen, you need to have water. Now this at the bottom here is actually a delta. The same as this is actually a delta. So the water runs this way out to the Mediterranean Sea, or the Great Sea as it was originally named, and the water runs from the mountains in Turkey, and it goes down this way until it comes out in the Persian Gulf. So these became the two sources of all life as we read it in the Old Testament. So historical recording, it says that they already had sophisticated cultures in Mesopotamia, which is what this area was known as, and of course Egypt, which we're all familiar with here. Does everyone realise that Mesopotamia, it sounds like an ancient name, doesn't it? Does everyone know when Iraq and Iran became nations, when they were named? You know how recent it was?
It was after World War II, no?
World War One.
Oh, World War I.
So before World War One, this was still Mesopotamia. Right? Then it changed after that when they divided the regions up, and we have all the issues today politically because of the different cultures and races of people. So this was still called Mesopotamia, literally a little bit over 100 years ago. Okay? So we're not that familiar with it today. We look at it and think, oh, it's really ancient, but in fact it's not. It wasn't that long ago. Egypt, of course, we still know as Egypt today, so we're familiar with that. So the agriculture, again because of the water, it was advanced, had elaborate drainage and irrigation. So this is all historically documented, what I'm explaining. Cities were founded and they were organised into city-states. So city-states, does anyone know what a city-state is? We actually still have some today. They still exist.
I think that it's a city, but it's a state, but it's small. So it's one city, it's like the where the Catholic are, how do you
Right.
call it?
Is it like a city with a lot of population?
What is the name?
The Vatican
The
City.
Vatican, that's right. So it's a state, but it's a city, it's just one place there.
Where else? Any others you can think of today? Where else?
Jerusalem?
No.
No, it's a Spanish one. No, it's not. It's there is the Grand Prix and it's the
Right,
the
well, that's
Queen
not
and
Spanish.
in Spain, the Queen and the
Monaco.
Monaco.
There's another one that's in Asia, pretty close to us here. Do you know what that is? A small country, but it's actually a city-state. What do you think it's called?
Japan.
No.
Campeche?
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Well, Hong Kong's part of...
Taiwan.
It was never actually separated. The British ruled it, but they were on a contract, so it's not. But there is a country that is, and it's actually Singapore.
Oh, yeah.
Singapore's a very small space. Supposed to be a city with a rural area. So basically a city-state means that you've got the population in the urban centre, and you've got the surrounding land which they would farm, right? They would graze their animals, etc. So that's supported a city. If you think about it, without transportation, you know, we have planes and trucks and all the rest of it nowadays, helicopters of course. So we can move things long distances, but back then everything was grown relatively close to where you lived. So they were called city-states. So when we read the Bible and we talk about all the cities when they entered the land of Canaan, they were all city-states. They were small. There was a city, there was a surrounding grazing and farming land, and then that was a kingdom. So they would have a king that would rule over. So today when we think kingdom, we think of big empires, kings, you know, big swaths of land. But in these days, every city was virtually called a kingdom. So when you think about this, it changes the scale about how you look at the Bible. So when we get into the time where we start seeing the empires form, this was new. This wasn't how it was in the past. You know, every king had his army, every king had his city with the gates. They had the rural peoples. If someone wanted to, you know, to raid them, or and this is what the ancient story's about, they would raid each other. If things weren't going well, they wanted to get wealthy. So what would they do? All the farmers would come inside the gates behind the city walls. They'd close the gates and they'd try and fight them off. That was life. That's how it was in those times. So when we look at all these ancient places, many of these places that we talk about in the Bible, they weren't very big. Okay? So this is where, when I explain shortly that Abraham came out of, you'll understand it was actually a huge place. In fact, the city of Ur was actually known to be the largest city in the world at that time. Again, the Bible just says Abraham was called out of, so you don't know much about the place. Okay, so by this time, because it's recorded, by 3000 BC, we know that they're irrigating, we know that they're farming, they've got buildings, they have administration systems to run their society, and so they already had forms of writing, because that's how we know about it today. Okay, so it is recorded. And the same was true for Egypt. So basically, these areas and these areas are the ancient of ancients, and they're the developed parts that happened. And if we read our Bible, it tells us that they came down from, so that's what we're going to have a look at. So it's not surprising that history began in the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The first book of the Bible, Genesis, explains that after the great flood, the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, it says they moved eastward and found a plain in Shinar, which is Babylonia, and settled there. So that's in Genesis 11:2. Okay, so we're talking in this region over here. Okay, it says in Genesis 8:4, it says that Noah's ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, as I mentioned. So all of this history that I'm sort of talking about, it's actually all recorded in the Bible. It doesn't explain it in detail, but it sure is there. And it makes a lot of sense, because when we place it onto a map, and we can actually see these rivers, you can sort of see, well, it makes sense that they actually went to these places, because to survive they needed to have water and farm. Okay, so the source of the Euphrates River comes from what's called the Caucasus Mountains up here, and it's north of the Ark's resting place. They flow southwesterly, so down here, and they bring water down onto the plains. So down here, if you look at Iraq today, it's all pretty flat. Right? So these are all plains, and the water would actually come down from these mountains. So that's the Euphrates. So if you're looking, so this is the Euphrates River. This is the Tigris River of the Bible. So you can imagine that the land that's in between is very fertile. And in fact, in this little pocket here is where Babylon was, right? Between two lots of rivers splitting and joining back again. So that's where all the farmland was. So the land between the rivers, as it's called, is actually what Mesopotamia means. So when we look at Mesopotamia, that means the land between two rivers. That's what the name means. Okay? So it was fed by this, and so they get the mineral rich. So you understand with mountains, you've got volcanic mountains. So the minerals that come off, so when the ice melts and the glaciers and they bring all the minerals down this river, and that mineral-rich water would be what the farmers could actually use. So that's basically the principle of why they went where they went. So Noah's descendants founded what? What does the Bible tell us? Noah's descendants founded which city? Noah's descendants.
Jerusalem.
No. Any idea? What's the first city we talk about in the Bible?
Yeah.
Go to Genesis 11, chapter 2. Now before we hear about...
Yeah, it's Jerusalem. Israel.
No. Come on. Open your Bibles.
That's only a big place.
Genesis chapter 11. What city did you find
They
there?
founded a plain in Shinar.
Right. So Shinar is Babylonia. The city is Babylon. Okay. Remember when Zerubbabel, I pointed out on the genealogy list, when he was named, he's called Zerub Babel. He came back from Babylon. He was born in Babylon. Okay, so this is where the Tower of Babel was. So Noah's descendants founded Babylon, and the word Babylon means, anyone know what Babylon means?
One language?
No. It actually means the gate of God. See, at this point in time,
So they were all together there?
they were together. Well, they separated. The sons separated. Right? Remember, they had their wives, so they went to separate lands. They were going to grow their crops, etc., etc., etc. So the thing is that it's called the gate of God because at this point in time, this is Noah's sons. So when Noah went through that whole experience with the flood, building the ark, etc., obviously God selected him for a reason, didn't he? Because he was righteous. He was in right relationship with God. So there wasn't any question about they did or they didn't believe that God was who he was. At this point in time, they knew who he was. So when they built this city and this ark came to rest in this place and they went down and found this lovely land with water, etc., etc., and fertile, they called it the gate of God. Okay? Now, when you look, there's a lot of pictures. I have a little picture here, but I don't know if you can see it, but you might have seen different pictures. But they talk about the gardens of Babylon. It was deemed to be a very beautiful place because it was lush with water. Okay? So when people lived there, they started to develop this place. And the Bible says that Noah's descendants mistakenly attempted to build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. Okay? So that they could make a name for themselves. So what happened? They survived the flood, they went out, and suddenly it's all about them. Their pride kicks into gear, and they're going to make this place the most wondrous place on the earth. And so it talks about them building something that reaches to the heavens. Why do you think it's significant that the Bible talks about reaching the heavens? Later on the Bible talks about all of the altars that were built to various gods. They're always built in high places. So always have this association with height. When you go before a king or a queen, the throne sits on a
High thing.
platform, doesn't it? And so you're always lower than those who rule. There's always this thing about height. Adolf Hitler, he was this little short man. And all of his film crew, they were made to film him from beneath looking upwards. If you look at all the film footage, it's always from beneath because he was short. He always wanted to be filmed and made look like he was greater in stature as the ruler. So there's this mentality that comes with pride that we have to be big and tall to be powerful. So when they build monuments, if we go around the world today, what do we have? Eiffel Tower? Up
The
in the air.
Leaning Tower.
Right? What's going on nowadays with skyscrapers? We just built the latest, biggest, tallest. It's like a show of your strength or your might to build something as high as you can into the heavens. So they had the same mentality back then at this time. But there's an arrogance that came with it. Okay, so believing that if they didn't, that they would be scattered over the face of the whole earth, which again comes from Genesis 11:4. God opposed the arrogance of these people and said, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So God realised at this particular point in time that man's pride had already kicked into place, and he had to do something in order to stop them from continuing what they were actually doing. So God's concerned that once again, so soon after the flood, that a united and godless society was seeking its own destiny. What had just been flooded is returning already. So when the people of Babylon sought to control their destiny in the absence of God, their pride walked them into the very circumstances they sought to avoid. So the consequence of the action saw them, the Bible tells us, scattered all over the earth. So God separated them, and their language confused, so they will not understand each other. So answers another one of the questions of modern society. Why do we all have different languages? Obviously there was languages that were formed that were different to each other so that we couldn't understand one another. Obviously if people can't communicate and they're scattered, they're not going to be able to come together and build some superstructure, are they? So this is what God actually put into place. So this movement of people from Babylonia saw new developments. So you can imagine, originally they come down, they settle in this place, they build the tower, and God scatters them. So that means they're no longer all just here, they're now got to find somewhere else to actually live. So what happens is we see the development in the region of the Near East. Egypt became another rapidly advancing society because they went down here first. So this was actually developed after this. Okay? Oftentimes people always talk about Egypt being the oldest civilization that's known in the world. Not true. This is actually older over here. So, so societies, remember what I've said, they were predominantly agricultural in this time. So prior to the time of Abraham, one of the cities that actually developed, you can imagine that they're here, and when they get developed, people will follow the course of the water because they need to live. Okay, so when you see the maps, you'll see that all of the ancient cities, they're all dotted along the different river systems. They're not out here, they're not up here, they're following these river systems. So this is where they all started off. And so Abraham was in this city-state called Ur, which is right down here. Now, I've put this other map here, this is this section, and what it actually shows is this ancient city. So Sumer, as it was called, is right down here, but the Persian Gulf back then, and here's an answer for global warming, the Persian Gulf in these days was about another 120 kilometres inland. So where Ur was, when Abraham was born, it was actually just marginally inland off the ancient Persian Gulf. They would go up the river with their boats and they would park them in the harbour where this ancient city was. So today, this is all desert, all of it. So we're talking about the ice caps coming and going, and they're talking about how we're flooding at the moment, and yet the ocean's 120 k's further away than what it was back at the time of Abraham. Whoop. Thank you. Yeah. So, my point. So we can see, even by studying this, that we have an answer for global warming tonight. There you go. So 120 k's inland. So this is where Abraham was actually settled. Okay. So we've spoken about the city-state. So you picture, we've got a city-state where they were, and we have this city of Ur. Now in Ur they had dynasties. So dynasties, everyone know what a dynasty is? Anyone used to watch the TV shows? So what's a dynasty?
The families.
Royal family.
Right, like a royal family, that's right. So in ancient times you would have a new king who would usually win a battle. Perhaps they were a general of an army. They would win a battle, they'd take over a city or a region, and they would then have their children would have their children, and that would be known as a dynasty. That would be known as a dynasty.
It's okay,
And that it's okay. That dynasty would have its generations of kids. Okay? So those kids would go through until some point in time when another conqueror would come in, or, as often happened, somebody wouldn't have a child. They couldn't have children. Okay? And so as a consequence of that, you would have a new dynasty that would be formed. Okay, so at this particular point in time in Abraham time, it's all historically documented that there was what was called the third dynasty of Ur. I won't go into all of it, but there was a dynasty. There was a king called Ur-Nammu, and he was actually documented in history. And in fact, in the British Museum, they have what they call a clay, what's it called? A cylinder seal. And a cylinder seal is something where they would carve into the cylinder, and then they get a piece of clay, and when they rolled the cylinder over the clay, it would leave the image that was carved into the cylinder. Okay, so I've got a picture of it here. This is actually the original picture, it's in the British Museum, of the actual king. Okay, so each of these characters, they've got the governor, they've got the king, and they're actually talking about the moon god, and it's actually on there as a crescent. Right? So that's why the moon's there. So they've got ruler and God as they saw it in those days. So we know from this sort of documentation that they were actually worshipping a moon god at this particular point in time. So we start to get a bit of a picture of what was actually going on. In these times, I don't know how you've read your history, but there's actually a ruler called Sargon the Great, so they knew who actually founded the city. So it's amazing that we read the Bible, we get this one line, and you wonder about this place, but we can actually place it in time because the ruler who founded the city is actually dated. So the dating for him was 2334 BC. Okay, between the 24th and the 22nd century BC. They gained control over all the known people in this lower region down here, and they united them into one, empire, if you will, a mini empire kingdom. So all these cities in here, for the first time, the city-states actually were combined to form a bigger kingdom. Okay, so we start seeing a difference in the actual scale. So with these dynasties, there was 3 different dynasties. They changed, kings came back and forth and they fought. And this is the time that Abraham was basically born into. Okay, so with this documentation, I'll just find it, sorry. So with the documentation, there comes information about the ziggurat, okay, because it was part of their society. So they had priests, and they had a religious site, if you will. So last week I showed you, I've got some pictures up here again. So they built this ziggurat. So this is in the 1920s. Right? So this is when it was still called Mesopotamia. This photo was taken at the end of World War I. So this is the ziggurat of Ur as it actually looked, and this is a model of it, how it would have looked when it was originally built. Okay, this, where the hump is, it actually sticks out of the top of that slightly. So the American soldiers, this photo is actually taken by an American soldier, so they were in fighting all the way around this particular area. So, so this place still exists today. So again, people who don't believe what the Bible says, history documents the place. You can physically go to the place today. The Bible says it's there. So we get this confirmation for people who perhaps don't believe the Bible that this place is real, it did exist, and it's still there to this very day. And you've got to think about how old this thing is. I mean, we're talking what now, 4, 5, about 5,500 years ago. This is very, very old, extraordinary. So this is still in this place. Okay. So what was society like? Being a city-state, the society and this rivers that came down, basically you've got this city. They were doing all of the trades, so they'd have metal workers, they'd have leather workers, right? What does the Bible say right in the beginning with the sons of Adam? One was a farmer, one was a herder. One was a herder. So one looked after animals, one grew crops. So we know right from the beginning that they had different functions. If we go a little bit past that in the Bible, we actually start hearing about metal workers, for example. Okay, so technology developed. So in this place, it's all recorded that they had people that worked leather, they had people that produced food, they had blacksmiths that made metal objects, they had a harbour for the boats to actually come in. So the trade would come up the Persian Gulf from other countries, from Egypt predominantly. So obviously from here, Sinai Peninsula, back up the other side. So they were able to sort of connect to these different regions. So Abraham was born into this. Now history records that this society was actually 65,000 people in population, approximately the time of Abraham. So it was the biggest recorded population in history at this time. So when we think of Abraham being called out, we perhaps don't really understand what that actually meant. So what happens is that when he was called out, we might look at that as a little sort of village or a dusty place. We don't know whether, was he a shepherd? Does the Bible tell us he was a shepherd? It tells us when he left Ur that they took animals with him. But was he actually a shepherd when they were there, or did they take the animals with them? We don't know that, right? But we know in society in that day that they were actually, there was people either farming, they were either grazing animals, or they basically had trades, and that was it. That's all that society had. So with the ziggurat, the people were obliged to have an order in their society where they had their king, they had their priesthood, and basically they believed that the moon in the sky was actually a god, and so they would actually go and worship there. They would actually take a tithe and offering. There's recordings that show that they had this thing called the temenos, which was the courtyard area, and people would go in there, they would line up. The priests actually had the cuneiform tablets with the clay, and when people brought their donation, they would actually press in what they actually donated. So this is all documented. So you can imagine if Abraham was there, he would have been queuing up with everybody else. He would have been taking whatever his offering is. It would have been recorded. He would have gone up to the top of the ziggurat. Again, this place is there today. So this is what God called Abraham out of. Okay, so that's the setting. So this is the point, where we start the journey with Abraham, where we understand he was where he was because of where Noah landed. They went down the river to Babylon, and because God scattered them, there was other cities formed, which is where Abraham came from. The Bible tells us all of these steps. When he was called out from Ur. It was a significant place. It was a big place. And when he was actually called out, which we'll go into on the next lesson, we're told that he goes up to Haran, which is up here. And so, of course, what do? They follow the river. They need to have water. So everything that God tells them to do, it has a purpose. If you were going to go to Israel, which is over here, you would say, well, let's just go straight across there. That's really quick. But they would have died. There's no way they could survive. There was no water for the animals, no water for people, and they wouldn't have actually been able to carry enough water to do that distance. Okay? They calculate that in those days when they had livestock, that the most they could do was about 6 miles or 9 kilometres a day, herding their animals, walking. So if you extrapolate that right across that distance, they'd be very dead before they got there. So of course they followed the river system up here. So I'm going to bring it to a close there. So it's very historical tonight. We're basically setting the scene for where Abraham was called out of, so you've got some context. So you also understand that when God, and we'll go into it more as we go, when God called Abraham out, he actually came and met him face to face. Why? We spoke about this last week. Why? Because he lived in this place with this life, with the false gods. And so how would he believe that this wasn't another false god if he didn't meet him face to face? So we have this extraordinary story of faith where basically in all of these societies at the time, nobody was actually walking with the Lord anymore. So Abraham was called out of that, and he was to go on this journey which would take him away from everything that he actually knew. And that's why they call him the father of the faithful, because he stepped out into the unknown. He stepped into something which he had no way of knowing whatsoever. They lived in these regions, they never left their regions. And so, if you or I were called and said, look, you live here, you don't know anything about Perth on the other side of Australia, right, we're in ancient times, and God said, I want you to go all the way over there. The chances that you would go would probably be pretty limited, because you wouldn't know what was to expect, would you? You wouldn't trust that. So part of Abraham's story is this whole very background. He's pulled out of it, he walks in faith, he takes a step, he doesn't know what's going to come before him, but he does it anyway. And he also, really significantly, because of what we're talking about, he actually walks away from his whole upbringing. He walks away from what he knew, right? He walked away from worshipping something different. So it's a huge decision in our lives for each of us if we actually come out of our society, come out of the place that we know. So how many people here are living where they were born in this room? My son. Nobody else, isn't it? So how many people from overseas? There you go. So there's only 2 of us who aren't from overseas. So that means at some point in time, you made a decision to leave your upbringing, what you know, how you went through life, perhaps where you went to church, or if you were in another religion, you left all that behind. And why would you do it? What was everyone's reason for leaving?
Better life.
Better life?
My parents brought me here when I was a baby.
Okay, bought by parents.
You said better food.
Better food. Any other reasons? So we got family.
I was young, naive, and I didn't know what I was doing.
Young, naive, didn't know what to do.
I wanted a better life for the kids.
Better life for your
That's
kids.
what I thought.
Right. And so my parents came here for the same reason. They came out of a cold climate country, and they decided that life had to be better somewhere else. But you can just imagine, for each of you, that first moment, when you're a child and your parents are taking you, probably just go along because I guess you feel safe, well you should do. But if you're a grown-up and you actually go somewhere, there's that anticipation of things that are yet unseen. So we start talking about the meaning of faith from Hebrews 11:1. Okay, so it's a big, big step. And then when you get to the other end, is it going to be what you expected? Are you going to live your life the same way? Do you expect to live your life the same way? People who have come from different cultures with different languages, practicing different religions, huge step, isn't it? It's a huge step, because you're leaving everything you know behind. Even the food and the way you cook it, and the flavours, all those things, they all get lost along the way. So you've got to think about Abraham. They left their society, they left their beliefs behind, they changed everything in their life. So there's only one reason that Abraham did that, and that's because God called him to. So understand, this story of Abraham is not one of choice. He didn't actually choose to, like some of you may have, or your parents did, or my parents did. He actually left because God called him to, and God didn't reveal to him at that point in time what it was going to look like. When we read the Bible, we find out that when he went to Haran with his father and stayed there for a number of years, God actually told him to leave his family then. He was told to leave where he lived here, then he was told to leave his family up here, and then when he went into the land of Israel, that's when we start hearing about the covenant, the promise that God actually had for him. So he went through all this journey, and it goes over decades, because when he went up here, it was quite a long time before he left his father again.